The night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Welcome to the show. It's Beyond Reality, and I am your host, J.V. Johnson. It's going to be an interesting night. We're going to take a bit of a departure from our normal course of conversation, if you will. We talk about a lot of paranormal things here. We talk about conspiracy things here. We talk about a lot of the strange, the unusual. And sometimes, like when we talk to Mr. Lobo about horror movies, or sometimes when we had Dee Snider on about his music and his work in film. I'm trying to think of some other examples, but sometimes we delve into a bit of a pop culture discussion, and that's what we're going to do tonight. I'm really excited about this because in addition to being just an interesting topic, as you probably know by now if you've been a viewer or listener to this program for some time, I am a huge Beatles fan. I am, not only do I love their music, I love their story. I find everything about them fascinating. And tonight we're going to be talking with Ivor Davis. He is a journalist and an author who was given the privilege, in retrospect, at the time it was just a job, but in retrospect it was quite a privilege, to actually be paired up with the Beatles and travel with them throughout the United States when they were on tour. He was covering their exploits for a British media outlet. And he's ended up writing a book about it. And why not? Why wouldn't you? And we're going to talk to him about what he experienced, who the Beatles were behind the scenes, all that kind of stuff tonight. And we're going to do it with Ivor. In addition to, if we have time, and I'm a little concerned that I won't get all my Beatles questions out in the amount of time we have. But if I do, and we've got enough time, he's also written about the Manson murders, and we're going to talk about that as well, assuming we have time to do it all. But either way, it's going to be a fantastic discussion, talking with somebody who actually had the unbelievable experience of traveling with the Beatles when they were on tour in America. We do have a Patreon support page. Because of the way we've changed the formats of the program, we are no longer an advertising-driven show, although we do have some advertising. But it's not the bulk of it. I mean, before the program switched formats, and one of the reasons we did switch formats is we were running 21 minutes an hour of breaks. That only leaves 39 minutes to talk. And when you're going in and out, you got to take a couple minutes away. At least a minute with each break, 4 breaks. That's another 4 minutes, so 25 minutes because you're using bumper music too. So we've reduced that drastically. So now we have an opportunity for people to support us directly. And the way to do that, if you're listening as a podcast, you'll see a little link in the description, say support this podcast. But if you're watching on YouTube or listening on YouTube, all you have to do is go to Patreon and find Johhaw, Johhaw. And when you find that, there are a couple different options for you to support the program, and many people have already done that, and we thank every one of you. And as we progress here, we're going to do some special things and special broadcasts just for our Patreon supporters. Please support the program. Go to patreon.com/Johhaw. That's Johhaw. It's very difficult to debate the fact that 4 lads from Liverpool changed the world in a way that no musicians, no celebrities, no people, no politicians ever have. And of course, I'm talking about the Beatles. Tonight, we're honored to have as a guest Ivor Davis. Ivor is a journalist and an author. He first came to America in the early 60s. He was appointed the West Coast correspondent for the London Daily Express in 1963. And his first big assignment came in 1964. And that assignment, to hang out, travel with, and get to know John, Paul, George, and Ringo, members of what was at the time a new pop group from Liverpool that some people had heard of called the Beatles. Ivor, welcome to Beyond Reality. It's a real honor to have you here tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's great to be on, and I hope we're going to have a great chat about everything from the Beatles to maybe Charles Manson.
I'm hoping we get to everything, but I'm going to warn you in advance. I am a super fan when it comes to the Beatles, so I have a lot of questions, and I know you've got the answers. You're one of the few people in the world that actually has these answers, so this is really exciting. But before we get too deep, tell us how a reporter A journalist, a West Coast correspondent for the London Daily Express, finds himself traveling with the Fab Four.
Well, a lot of it is pure, unadulterated luck. Because I was the West Coast correspondent for one of the biggest newspapers in England. And the Beatles were invading America for the very first time. And my newspaper also had made a deal with George Harrison that George Harrison was going to write a column for them. However, George was so busy singing and doing all the things that George does that Muggins, me, happily, was assigned to travel with them, get to know them, write George's column, be his ghostwriter. And that was the beginning of what I say was an incredible ticket to ride. Because don't forget this, JB, that in America, communications back then were not as good as they are today. And the only thing most of us knew about the Beatles was in February 1964, these four lads showed up on the Ed Sullivan variety show. That was when TV had variety shows. And believe it or not, they had 74 million people tuned into the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan show. And Brian Epstein, their manager, said, hey, there's a lot of people out there that want to see these My Beatles. And off we go in the summer of 64 for a almost 6-week tour of America and Canada. And I was lucky enough to be on board their private jet.
And to put things in perspective, the Beatles at that point, prior to that Ed Sullivan performance, had become a rather, I guess, big, we'll use the word, hit in England. They were known, they were popular, but really making it in the United States was something that every music act, every group saw as the real opportunity or the real goal, and very few did it. Very few were able to cross the pond or come from outside of the United States and be successful in America. So the Beatles really didn't know what was going to happen, did they?
Well, you're absolutely right, because Brian Epstein, their manager, the guy that took them from scruffy, swearing, smoking guys to these likable lads, Brian Epstein, he knew that most of the rock stars that came over from England to America, Tommy Steele, you probably, I don't think too many of your listeners have heard of him. But many of the rock stars of England came to America and they absolutely nosedived. So Brian was terrified and excited, and guess what? The Beatles did rather well.
There is, if I understand the history of it well enough, there were some what would be considered, I guess not bootleg, but I guess independent record companies that may have been distributing a few of the Beatles songs. There were some imports, I guess, that were hard to get a hold of, but you might be able to find one or two. So there was a bit of a subculture that started to become familiar with the Beatles prior to that Ed Sullivan performance, but it was Ed Sullivan that brought them mainstream.
Yeah, Ed Sullivan was the make and break program. Because as you pointed out a moment ago, JB, the Beatles had a hard time getting a recording company to pick them up. And they started off with a Chicago company that nobody had ever heard of that basically handled black entertainers. So that wasn't quite the way the likable lads thought they would make it. And in fact, there's a story that not too many people know, that Louise Harrison, who was the sister of George Harrison, tried desperately taking records around a few Midwest recording stations, the radio stations, rock and roll stations, to try and get them desperately to play the Beatle music. Well, as soon as they did Ed Sullivan, as soon as they hit America in August 1964, all hell broke loose, and boy, did the Beatles take off.
So you got the assignment. The Beatles were coming to tour. You were assigned to travel with them, get to know them, kind of look under the hood a little bit to see what made them tick. Did you meet them at the airport when they arrived, or when did you hook up with them?
Well, I was in Los Angeles, and they arrived very, very jet-lagged to San Francisco a few hours before I flew into San Francisco. But I knew something was afoot, because I showed up at the Hilton Hotel in San Francisco. It was a late afternoon. There were about 3,000 girls outside the hotel, and I had to fight my way through there.
Wow!
I managed to get up to their floor because I was booked into the hotel by the Beatles, by Derek Taylor, their press guy, and I met the Beatles. And I must tell you, the welcome that they gave me was not very overwhelming, because they were jet lagged and they were watching television. They were watching themselves arrive on television. So they kind of sloughed me off. But then when they realized that I was there for the duration of their tour, we became very good friends, and we hang out with them and all these wonderful things that happened because the Beatles could not leave their hotel, and they were stuck with guys like me, Arthur Schreiber from Westinghouse. We were their family on the road. So we got to know them pretty well as time continued on the tour.
Prior to you being assigned to them, and prior to them coming to America, you obviously, the UK was your home base, but you were in the United States. Did you have an awareness of who these guys were?
Well, to be honest with you, vaguely, because don't forget, we didn't have the internet. We couldn't punch in Google and Google Beatles. We couldn't learn about them. I mean, I'd heard these young guys were doing well in Europe. They were doing well in England. They were selling out in England. They were getting crazy crowds at their concerts. But the communication, as I say, was so, it's like about 3% of what it is today. And I knew a bit about them, but I quickly did a bit of research. I made sure to watch them on Ed Sullivan. I saw the screaming and the frenzy of the Beatles, and I thought, well, they could do well, and I think they did well.
So you get introduced to the Beatles. You say they were kind of a jet lag. They were watching television. They weren't giving you a real warm reception. What was your first impression of these four guys?
Well, I kind of liked them because don't forget, they were sort of rock stars in England, in Europe, and they were pretty kind of low key. No BS, no big movie star, rock star persona. They were like four likely lads who you might run into in the pub in Liverpool. They were not, and even throughout the tour, they never became big-headed. They were never inaccessible. They were always ready to talk. I mean, we used to hang out, and I used to play Monopoly with John at 2 a.m. I used to wander into their suite and help myself to their free drinks from their mini bar, much to the chagrin of their manager, Brian Epstein, who kept saying, this bar bill you guys is too much. Cut back on the drinking. Anyway, but so it was like buddies instantly, but don't forget we were probably around the same age. I mean, I think I was an aged 2 years or 3 years older than them.
I mean, it's also important to remember that the Beatles at that time were basically kids. I mean, they were very young men, 23, 24, 25, somewhere right in there.
Exactly. I'm even younger than that. I mean, they were in their early 20s. They were in America. They were seeing that America was falling down in front of them and treating them like that they were rock stars, treating them like they were superstars, and they liked it. But at the same time, they were contained to their hotels and they couldn't go out. That was the only negative that they told me. They would love to have seen more of America, but everywhere we went, whether it was Vegas or New York, whether it was New Orleans, they were trapped in their hotel every hour of the day because it was too risky to step outside.
Were you quickly accepted into their, what we'll call their inner circle?
I think I was, mainly because I was round about their age, mainly because we all have a dark, twisted sense of humor, and the Beatles had a twisted sense of humor, particularly John, who was a real, the real character. But don't forget the John and the Paul and the Ringo and the George you learnt about, and we all learnt about much later, evolved. They were callow fellows, and they became became much more mature as they went on. But in those days, they were pretty down to earth. There was no BS about them, and they were fun to be with.
In retrospect, it's easy to look back and say, wow, what a magical time, what a magical moment. And of course, they're the Beatles. But they weren't really the Beatles at that time. They were still being discovered, especially in America. Did you have an understanding at the time of how historical those weeks with those four guys was going to be?
I've got to confess, JB, that I did not. And you know what? Neither did the Beatles.
Right.
Because when I asked them at the end of the tour what they were going to do with themselves, and so Ringo said he was going to open a hairdressing salon for his girlfriend, who became his wife. John said he might write music for other people. So did Paul. And they had no idea that 55 years later, or thereabouts, that we would be talking about them. They didn't have a clue, because they didn't realize the longevity would go on, and they didn't realize that their reservoir of music that my kids and my grandkids enjoy, and probably many young people that you know enjoy, is still around, is still sung, it's being performed by every single recording star. It's being played by symphony orchestras. I mean, they didn't realize that. They thought they would last maybe 5 years.
I remember seeing in one of the documentaries about the Beatles, I remember seeing a clip, and I think it was George Harrison, that said something to the effect of, we could be big-headed and think that we're going to last 7 years, but that's probably not going to happen. And then he went on to, talk about other things. There's a couple things about that statement that I find unique. One is that they did last about 7 years as a group. Because they ended up breaking up around 1970. So it is about 7-8 years, whatever that is. But their music is absolutely timeless. And I don't think anybody was prepared for that.
No, nobody was prepared for that. Nobody was prepared for the longevity of their music. But you're right, Jimmy, because it was 50 years ago this year that they officially broke up. I mean, it was a terrible divorce. I mean, John was going against Paul, and the other two didn't know where they were. Brian Epstein, who was their leader, the guy that sort of manipulated them into the image that we all know of the old days, was dead. And they got into a terrible, ferocious fight. John's team and Paul, Ringo, and George's team. So it was a terrible fight to the finish. And yet they were so talented that they've all gone on to perform as individuals. I mean, Ringo is still performing, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
Paul, of course, I saw several months ago, and he packs in 55,000 regularly. He performs for 3 hours and 20 minutes. When I traveled with the Beatles, let me ask you this, JV, how long do you think they sang for when they did the concerts in San Francisco, in L.A., in New York? What do you think they sang for?
I know it wasn't long by today's standards, but how long did they sing for?
For about 27 minutes.
Wow.
and it was a running joke, because they said they tried to break their record each time, and there was not much chit-chat between the shows. They did 10 songs, and they lasted, and they went, if they actually overdid it, they went to 30 minutes. I mean, you would not pay today a big ticket money to see a group perform for 30 minutes, would you?
Probably not, but I also know that the ticket prices back then were significantly less, even if you adjusted from inflation. I've seen current ticket prices going for thousands of dollars. What did they charge for those concerts when you were with them?
Well, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to turn the question around, if I may, for a moment, JV, because when we went to see Paul McCartney, I met a young lady who said she goes to every show and sits in the second row and pays about $1,800 for a ticket.
Wow.
But then you could get a ticket for $350. And the best tickets, I mean, you really wanted the hotshot tickets up front, you could cash out $5.50. Wow. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it?
It is quite amazing. And those concerts, now you're traveling with them, they're performing for 27 minutes. Could you hear anything? I mean, could you even tell there was music playing?
Well, the answer to that question is no and no. Because the moment they showed up on stage, the moment they showed up on stage, the girls started screaming, and I couldn't hear. I sat in the front row at every concert so I could make a fast getaway with the Beatles. Because the girls sang and listened, they couldn't hear the song. Now, I must tell you a funny story. I was talking on one of the Beatle speeches that I did to a man who said that he remembered now she's a grandmother, but she was a young girl. She went to see the Beatles, I think, in New York, and she said when he picked her up, he took her home. What was the concert like? Oh, it was fantastic. What was the songs and the music like? She said, I couldn't hear a single word. And he said to her, then why was it so great? And she said, because we were breathing the same air.
Wow.
So there you go.
Wow. Now, when you hear stories like that, and when you see footage of those concerts, and you see the way the teenagers, particularly the girls, were reacting, this was much more than just the music they had written and were playing. What else did you sense from them that created this?
Here's what I sensed, JV. What kept happening was, and I saw the girls kind of freaking out, and then much later, when I got round to writing my book, and I spoke to many women who had been teenagers at the time, and they were executives, they were top flight people in responsible jobs, and they were Beatles fans. And I would say, well, what was it about it? I mean, you didn't hear a single word. Why? And they would say, well, Ringo was in love with me. Paul is passionate about me. I would say, how do you know? And they would say, well, when I went to the concert, Paul waved back and George smiled at me. Wow. I mean, there it is. That's that was the attraction. They each of the girls, each of the spectators had a passion for one particular Beatle. And for some reason in their kind of fantasy minds, the Beatles loved them too.
We're talking with Ivor Davis. He's written a book called The Beatles and Me on Tour. He's got other books as well, Manson Exposed, A Reporter's 50-Year Journey into Madness and Murder. And hopefully we'll have some time to get to that. But as I said, Ivor, my list of Beatles questions is long. Tell me about each of the Beatles. Take a second or two or however long it takes and tell me about each of them individually. What were their personalities like when you were one-to-one with these guys?
Well, again, I preface my answer with something I told you a moment ago. These were young men. They were not fully formed individuals, so you've got to take that into account. Now, the most provocative, the most fun character was John Lennon. I mean, he was more fully formed than the rest of them. But John was great because he would entertain you when we used to have drinks and rum and cokes late at night when we went to play Monopoly with him at 2 a.m. I mean, he was an entertainer. I mean, we were in Key West, Florida, and we were watching because we missed a hurricane and we stopped in Key West, and John and I, and Derek, and a bunch of other people were sitting around in John's bungalow, and he was watching a guy called Fidel Castro, 25 miles away on television, doing a speech for an hour, and when it was finished, John stood up and did an absolutely impeccable imitation of Fidel Castro. And John was like that. I mean, he liked to provoke you, he needled you, he got a kick out of needling you. So he was probably the most entertaining individually of the Beatles. Paul was always I always use the term schmoozer. I mean, Paul was, as he is today, charming. I saw him last year. He is, he was Mr. Smoothie, and he was actually wonderful to get along with. Now, my only problem was with George Harrison, because I was writing his column, and I said to George, tell me what's in your mind, but George slept till 3 p.m, and I had to make up a lot of the stuff, and George got upset that his column under his name was pretty boring. So we had a little bit of an argument, but then I said, wake up in time, talk to me, George, and it improved. And then Ringo was kind of a as I say, a very callow young man. He played the drums, and I always say, well, you know, he was a very young drummer, and very young drummers are not intellectual. So Ringo was probably the least chatty of the lot. Although, as I said a moment ago, every one of them had a lovely sense of humor, and that's what made it work for us and me.
Those personalities, would you agree that individually they were amazing personalities, but the whole was greater than the sum of its parts when they were together?
Absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head, because every time we arrived in a new city, we would leave our private jet, and then we jumped into limousines. They were in the first limousine, I was in the second limousine. We'd go to a press conference for the local media. And I want to tell you, you can see the press conferences on YouTube. Tune in, when you have a few moments, tune in to the Beatles meeting the press. I mean, they arrive in Toronto, and after 10 minutes they have a press conference, and somebody said, "What do you think of the Canadian women, John?" And, you know, I mean, come on, I've only been there 10 minutes. But the amazing thing about the Beatles was that they could finish each other's lines. It was like that wonderful group that most people don't remember called the Marx Brothers, a comedy team.
I love the Marx Brothers. I love
physical.
I love the Marx Brothers. I love the Marx Brothers, Ivor. I watch Marx Brothers films all of the time.
Terrific. You know what I mean? So they were the Marx Brothers with Liverpool accents, because people ask, you know, how do you find America? You make a left turn to Iceland or something like that. You know, I can't repeat it. But they were very funny, and they were original, and no press conference was the same, although the questions were the same. So they were sharp, they were witty, and they had a sense of humor, which I think saved them from becoming swallowed up by their own egos.
We can only imagine being young men at that time, basically having the world at your feet, anything you wanted, and being celebrated everywhere you went. But in private, Ivor, were the Beatles happy? Were they happy at that point in their lives?
I think they were happy. I mean, look, here are these young men with healthy libidos, and they're getting these beautiful young women dying to meet them. Miss Albuquerque or Miss whatever, you know, Miss Los Angeles or wherever they were. They had a whole flotilla of young women coming in and sort of gasping to be in their presence, to breathe their air. And so they were having fun, you know, and I mean, John was married, the others were not married. And so when the beautiful young ladies came wandering through their suites and wanted to hold their hand or do more, the boys were quite happy to provide them with whatever they needed.
Did they? We've seen footage, we've seen testimony, we've seen interviews of the Beatles later on, and of course, as you mentioned, Ivor, the breakup was ugly. But did they get along in those early days? Were they friends?
Well, they did. I mean, they were all in the same boat. And I must tell you, on that first American tour, I never saw them arguing. I never saw them any spats, because they were in the same boat together. And they knew that they had to row in the same direction. I mean, that's not a great parallel, but you get the feeling,
sure.
Get the impression. So they knew that they were, and this was a dream. They all wanted to come. They all admired America. They all wanted to come to America. They just, I mean, it was a trip for them. And so the only thing, as I said a few minutes ago, was that John said to me, I wish I'd been able to step outside the hotel in Las Vegas, or I wish, you know, I wanted to go and see where John Kennedy had been assassinated when they were in Dallas. But Brian Epstein said, no, it's the wrong image. We want you to be footloose and fancy free and not get too serious with anyone. So they were young men who were bowled over by America, but it was a rather restricted view of America. I mean, we went, and I tell you, as I said, JB, we went from private jet. We landed in private airports, not the main airport. There was always the limousines there. We got a motorcycle escort to the hotel. The hotel was besieged by young women. The Beatles had to fight their way through there. They went to their rooms. They had guards on the floor because the girls did all sorts of very clever ways to try and get to meet the Beatles, and they were trapped in their hotel. So they would love to have gone out, but it didn't quite work that way. So it was America, but it was a restricted America, and since then, of course, as you know and as the world knows, they'd come and gone to America. John lived in New York, of course, as you know, and now today Ringo lives in L.A. Paul spends a lot of time in L.A. and has homes in other places. So in that period, back in the 60s, when they first came, they loved America. And America loved them, and the movie stars loved them, and everybody wanted to hold their hand.
You just, obviously, we're going to be talking about John Lennon a lot tonight, and it just occurred to me that John Lennon was 40 years old when he was killed, and that we're in the 40th anniversary of his death. It's been 40 years since John Lennon was shot.
Yeah, you know, when I heard of his death, of course, you can't believe it. But then, having lived in America, having been a journalist who covered the big stories, the John Kennedy assassination, I happened to be tragically in the kitchen when Bobby Kennedy got killed. You know, living in America, as we all know, people do get killed. People who do, who have no control over what happens to them. And what happened to John, it was like, a horrible, sick feeling of deja vu, because these things happen. They happen everywhere, but they seem to happen a lot in America. And as a journalist, I've covered a lot of some assassinations. So the death of Lennon, you wonder if John had been alive today, how would things be different? But as you said, his life was cut short at such a young age, really, for such a talented songwriter, performer as Lennon. It was and is a tragedy.
It really is, and it's still a day that many people, people always say everyone remembers where they were when they heard the news of JFK being shot. I think there's a lot of people that feel similarly about when John Lennon was shot. Did the Beatles during those days when you were traveling with them have any, idols of their own that they were looking to meet while they were in America?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I think the main person that they wanted to meet in America was Elvis Presley. And I was fortunate enough in 1965 to go with the Beatles to meet Elvis Presley. So they finally got to meet him. You know, in 64, Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, and Colonel Tom Parker, the manager of Elvis Presley, were trying to bring the boys together. But it never happened. Elvis was making movies, the Beatles were on tour. And finally, in August of 1965, I got a call to say, we're going to see Elvis. And I knew it was being planned. And so we went to see Elvis. And it was really, would you like me to tell you a little bit more?
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Well, the funny thing was that when we arrived at Elvis's house, and he had a home in Beverly Hills because he spent a lot of time in Vegas, he spent a lot of time in L.A., and of course he has Graceland in Memphis. So when we arrived finally to see Elvis, we walked in this large living room, and there was Elvis sitting on a couch looking like Elvis. And I always see him with his sideburns like shag carpeting. And he was sitting there, and it was Elvis. And the Beatles sat down, and for about 5 or 10 minutes, nobody did the introduction. Finally, there was nobody kind of the ambassador. I'd like you to meet John. John, this is Elvis. Elvis, this is Paul. None of that. Finally, Elvis gets up after 15 minutes and says, hey, you guys, I thought you came here to jam. If you don't want to do that, I'm going to bed. Well, that broke the ice. And so they started jamming for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then they began a conversation that I could overhear about the perils of flying around, because I think Buddy Holly had just been died in a plane crash, and they hit it off much, much better. But there was an underlining moment, a time, a period of what really was the atmosphere. And I'll tell you what the atmosphere was. I think Elvis was jealous, because Elvis had been knocked off the hit parade by the Beatles, these interlopers from England. At the same time, Elvis was making three, well, I'll say crappy movies, but three cookie-cutter movies every year. And he hated it. I know that. He thought they were awful. His heart wasn't in it. And here were these young interlopers from England. They came over. They were a smash hit. They knocked him off the hit parade. And they made one movie, A Hard Day's Night, and it was a smash hit. So Elvis was a bit jealous. And I realized a few years later that he really was jealous, because he went to see Richard Nixon a few years later. He went to see Richard Nixon at the White House. He took a couple of six guns out in the White House and handed them to Nixon as a gift. That was quite funny, because you couldn't do that today.
Right.
And he said to Nixon, I would like to be your ambassador to the young people of America to get you votes. And he said, and this is where the Beatles were upset, he said, those Beatles, he said, they earn and take all the money from America. They go back to England with the money they earned in America, and they badmouth America. Well, that wasn't true. And I want to tell you that the Beatles, I know this personally, were so upset with that statement that Elvis was bad-mouthing them that, they never met again after that one occasion. So Elvis was jealous. Of course, he had reason to be jealous. And the Beatles were turned off of him, and they never, after that one meeting in August of 1965, they never met again.
Once again, we're talking with Ivor Davis tonight. We're talking about his book, The Beatles and Me on Tour. By the way, you can go to his website and get more information about all of his work. It's ivordavisbooks.com. Brian Epstein, Ivor, he is credited to have created what we know as the Beatles. He saw them, as you said, they were a bit of kind of ruffians at the time, leather jackets, smoking and greased back hair, and the whole thing. Was he a genius? How did he capture this lightning in a bottle?
Well, in a way, he was a genius, because what he did was he took a sort of greasy rock and roll group, as you pointed out, with a leather jacket. I mean, they would perform on stage, they would smoke, they would swear, and they would do other things that were not really professional. And he cleaned up the act, and he put them into these very tight suits with no pockets, and he made sure that they had the same haircuts. And if you remember, and those of us who've seen the footage, and I saw it there, and we've seen the footage, at the end of each concert, they would bow kind of elegantly instead of wander off stage. So he really polished the act, and he was a taskmaster, because if any of them did things wrong during a concert, Brian read them the right act backstage. Believe me. I mean, even when at press conferences, if John had his hands in his pockets when he was talking to somebody, Brian would tell him off. So Brian was very, very good in turning them into a saleable commodity. I mean, I always loved the story when I asked somebody on the tour, what's the big deal between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, who are still going strong? And they said, well, the Beatles image is one that kids would take home to meet their parents with great joy, because they were clean-cut guys. But if you took the Rolling Stones home, they would burn the house down. So, that was the image difference. And Brian was terrific on that. He was a taskmaster. He read them the right act. But strangely enough, where he fell down was that he didn't have a clue about merchandising. He gave away the Beatles' merchandising because he thought it was nothing. And neither did the Beatles think merchandising was worth pursuing. I remember buying a Beatle wig for about $1.50, showing it to John. He was so upset at the trash that he went to the window of the hotel and he threw it out the window. So that was the way merchandising in those days was viewed, as a kind of a rather rough, not very classy way to make money. And look at the money they made. Look at it today. I mean, it's a well of money, isn't it? It's a fountain of fortune.
I'm trying to imagine Brian Epstein talking to John Lennon and convincing John Lennon that he had to do things a certain way, because from what I know, and you probably know way better than I, Ivor, John Lennon was a bit of a free spirit. How did he get him to comply?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, John always resented the fact that a lot of his freedom, his avant-gardeness, if you like, of doing your own thing, was constricted by Brian's way of saying, this is the way you should do it, boys. This is the way you behave in public. You know, you don't fart and you don't smoke and you don't swear. You have to be clean it up, because these are young people that are coming to see you. Young people, and destroy the image of these sort of hard rock and rollers, the ones that I forget what the thing is, where they used to smash guitars and that sort of stuff. I mean, the Beatles, you do not do this. You behave like gentlemen when you're on stage, and this is the way you've got to be. And John, who was the rebel of the group, just resented it like crazy, and would have big rows with Brian. He and Brian had a kind of a hot-cold relationship of the lot, I would say, because John would challenge his leadership, publicly and privately, and Brian and he often went at it, not publicly, but I know privately they had big arguments.
Now, Brian, for those of you who are not that familiar with the Beatles story, died of it was a drug overdose, wasn't it, Ivor? And it was only a few years later.
Yeah, it was a drug overdose. I mean, Brian was into drugs. Brian would disappear. He often took drugs. He drank, which is not a very good combination, as anybody knows today. And Brian would go into rehab, and treat his rehab like a hotel, because after 3 days he said, well, I've had enough of this, I'm leaving. So he checked out. So Brian was first of all, Brian, you've got to understand, was gay at the time in England when if you were gay, you could get arrested for being gay. So that was his big secret. I mean, we all knew it on the trip. We knew Brian was homosexual. But Brian was a sort of troubled soul because of that. I mean, he was from an upper class Jewish home in Liverpool, different class to the Beatles, and Brian kept the secret of his homosexuality from everyone, or tried to. And so you've got to realize that Brian was a sort of torn asunder, troubled man in his own personal life, and yet. You've got to give him credit for turning the Beatles into the Beatles that we all know and love.
The first film the Beatles made, A Hard Day's Night, critically acclaimed, a terrific movie. It's a real classic, not just of filmmaking, but of a snapshot of pop culture. It's amazing. And it also offers, in what seems to be a rather realistic fashion, a glimpse into the day of the life of being a Beatle. How accurate was that representation?
Well, I can tell you that it was absolutely spot on. There wasn't much exaggeration. And the amazing thing, JP, is that you and I can sit down and watch A Hard Day's Night today, and we can still enjoy it. It was right. Their first movie. It was beautifully shot, and it was really typical of the way things were. Screaming fans, chasing them through the streets, invading their privacy and all that sort of stuff, but done with a kind of jocular amusement by the director, and that was a film that was a huge hit. And then as they did a second movie called Help, which is a bit more manufactured, a little less enjoyable. But you know what? The Beatles did not like making movies. So when they had a 3-picture deal with Hollywood United Artists to make 3 movies, and those of you that remember The Yellow Submarine can remember that the Beatles were not in the film.
Right.
It was animated Beatles. And the funny thing was the Beatles had a contract to make 3 movies. Yellow Submarine was their 3rd movie, but they had to show up. And they show up for 30 seconds at the end of the film, and they say, we have fulfilled our obligations to the film studio. We're out of here. And that was a funny thing. So next time you see Yellow Submarine, which is a wonderful animated film, look for the Beatles for 30 seconds at the end.
Yeah, and that film won some awards, if I remember correctly, as well, didn't it? Did it even win?
It did.
Did it win an Academy Award for something? I don't remember.
I don't think it won an Academy Award. It might have been nominated, but It was, again, the amazing thing is, JB, that you can watch Help, you can watch A Hard Day's Night, and you can watch Yellow Submarine, as I have in the last 3 or 4 years, and you can enjoy it. It still holds up. Many old films, 50 years or whatever, kind of lose their appeal. But the Beatles movies are still fun. And I can tell you that for certainty because I very often go to screenings and talk after the film, and I enjoy the movie more when I see it later than I did when I first saw it.
Just like their music, it just holds up. It's an amazing testament. How many people were part of the entourage when you were traveling with the Beatles? How many people did it take to do what they were doing on tour in America back in those days?
Well, here's what happened. I mean, this is hard to believe. First of all, the recording, the microphones, the sound systems were terrible, and yet they had Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall, two road managers only for this. Now, I must tell you this story because I knew Neil and I knew Mal, and they were nice guys, and they started out with the Beatles in the early days, and the Beatles were very loyal to the Beatles and vice versa. So they had 2 people running their road show. Amazing. When I spoke to Paul McCartney 6 months ago at San Diego at Petco Stadium, where he was doing a concert in front of 55,000 people, and he performed non-stop for 3 hours and 10 minutes. Before the show, I went back to see him and chat to him. And I said to him, I asked him the question that you just asked. I said, you had Neil and you had Mal for those first tours. I said, now, when you go on the road, Paul, with your group now today, how many people do you have in the staff to make sure it goes like clockwork? And he said, take a guess, JB.
I'm going to guess that it's more than 2. I'm going to guess that it's more than 2.
Yes, you're right. How about 92?
Wow.
Yeah. and 92 people working full-time to make sure the trains run on time. You know what I mean? I mean, not the trains run on time.
Sure.
But make sure that it goes smoothly. And, of course, when they traveled in America, they had a small chartered jet. When they traveled in England, they had a beaten-up old car with no backseat. And when they go around the world, when Paul goes around the world, he travels with a jumbo jet and sometimes 2 jumbo jets to take the equipment. So times they are a-changing.
It's amazing. We have to go to break here in just a minute, and we'll continue the conversation on the other side of the break. But one more question before we head into this break. Did those days of traveling with the Beatles change your life, Ivor?
Well, strangely enough, I'd like to say they did, but they didn't, and I'll tell you why. I was a journalist working for a big London newspaper, and as soon as I got back to L.A., where I was headquartered, where my bureau was, day was the Warren Commission report. So yesterday was the Beatles' goodbye in New York. The next day I was thrown straight into the Warren Commission report. And you just go on. When you work for a daily newspaper, you don't get a chance to smell the roses because there's always a big story coming up next. So I regret that, and that's why it took me 48 years or so to write a bloody book about my travels. There it is.
We're talking with Ivor Davis tonight. His book is called The Beatles and Me on Tour. He's got other books also to his credit. You can get more information about all of that at his website, which is ivordavisbooks.com. Ivor, you were with them, and they were prisoners throughout that part of 1964 as they were traveling around the United States. That song was recorded, I think, in June of 65. You must have had an opportunity to overhear maybe all of them, but John and Paul particularly, writing some music because they probably didn't have much else they could do because they couldn't leave their rooms. Did you have that opportunity to hear them writing anything?
Well, first of all, let me just say, I enjoy talking to you, JB, because you are obviously a Beatle aficionado, an expert, because you know so much about them. And before I answer the question, I want to ask you a question. Do you mind if I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Did you ever get a chance to see Paul or Ringo lately? I mean, you're obviously too young to remember them, back in 64. Did you ever see any of the Beatles live? I know you said you watched documentaries about them.
I saw Paul McCartney in Philadelphia, and I don't remember exactly what year it was, but it was sometime in the early 90s, maybe 94. I'm not sure when he was on tour. I actually was going through some boxes the other day, moving things around in my studio, and I came across the program from that tour. But that was the only time I've had an opportunity. I almost went and saw Ringo Starr and his all-star band. They played rather close to me because I'm in upstate New York. But yeah. I had a conflict on the date, so I couldn't catch that show. But yeah, just the one Paul McCartney show.
Yeah, I mean, were you impressed with Paul, and did he do his 2-3 hour show?
Yes, he absolutely did, and I was very, very impressed by Paul. And in fact, the funny thing about it is I remember at that time thinking, wow, Paul is, what was the age? Maybe close to 60. I'm not exactly sure what it was. And he's performing like he's a 24-year-old Beatle again. He sounded great, looked great, performed forever, never left the stage. And to think that he's still doing that is just almost impossible to believe.
Well, that is amazing. And I'll tell you this, Ringo does a terrific job, but Ringo, of course, has support. So Ringo is not on stage with his all-stars all the time. He sings the ones that you want to hear him sing. And a Yellow Submarine and stuff like that. But then he steps off the stage and lets other younger talent do their thing. And then he comes back on. So Ringo's longevity is quite clever. And unlike Paul, Ringo does leave the stage. Paul is there from start to finish. So I'm sorry to deviate you from your questions, but can you tell me that question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
could you repeat that?
Sure. I had just noticed that the bumper song I had played, which is "Help," was written or was recorded in June of 1965, and it made me think that on that tour, when you were traveling with the Beatles in 1964, because they were prisoners, they had to find things to do in their hotel room, and I imagine songwriting was one of those things. It's very possible that the Beatles could have started working on "Help" or other songs that we all know during that time. Did you get an opportunity to overhear any of that?
Well, you're absolutely right, because as I said, and as you know, they couldn't leave their hotel rooms. But the other little piece of the jigsaw was that I knew that this was, don't forget, August, September, and for early December, the Beatles were contracted to do a new album for Christmas. And so on the road, there were very often I would wander into their suite because my room was next to their room, and it was sort of open doors. And there was John and there was Paul sitting on the carpet with yellow legal pads composing songs for their next album. So at least the prisoner thing worked out quite well for them, because if they'd had free access to the country, they could have been out to nightclubs and what have you. But it didn't happen. So they it was like, I mean, a bit sort of slave laborish, but they knew they had to come up with about 15 new songs between the time they left the tour to November, because then they had to go into the studio, Abbey Road, record the December album, and they knew they were under the gun. So I saw them composing. As soon as I saw them together on the floor with yellow legal pads, I just wave and leave. So yes, they worked very hard.
Did you ever have an opportunity after a song had been released and you heard it on the radio, say that you could say, "Wow, I remember when they were sitting on the floor with the legal pads working on that song"? Were you ever able to make that connection with any of the music?
Well, unfortunately, I never heard them singing the song, so I'm not going to claim that I did, but I know that every time a new album came out, that Brian Epstein cracked the whip. That not only did he have them on stage doing their concerts, I mean, think of it, and then he said, we need 15 new songs for the next album. So they were under the gun, and although I never saw them or heard them humming or any of that stuff, I knew that there was a deadline. And the Beatles the Beatles, I would say it was just Paul and John, of course, who were the main songwriters, because they used to toss a crumb to George and a smaller crumb to Ringo in those days to sing. And in those days that Paul and John wrote the songs, Ringo and George never kind of got a look in, and when they did, it was a seldom rare one or two songs. So they were the monopolies of their songwriting. And of course, as we know, when we listen to the songs, some of the greatest stuff is written by John and Paul, although in later years, after the Beatles broke up, George Harrison blossomed into a terrific songwriter, doing his own stuff. And it took the Beatles for George to bloom into a great songwriter and a great entertainer. But sadly, because of cancer, he died much too young. And Ringo is still performing and creating new music. And of course, Paul has written everything from the rock and roll favorites that we love to masses and symphonic work. So pretty talented guys.
Yeah, it's also incredible to think about John Lennon and Paul McCartney and what an instant hit machine, hit writing machine the two of them were. They could almost do it on command.
It was amazing. You're right. It's quite magical, really. But even when they broke up, both Paul and John wrote some great stuff
right.
that they didn't write together. So, I mean, the talent was there, the musical magic, or whatever you want to call it, along the lines of some of the Lerner and Lowe's, the Broadway people of the great. Somebody said, they're the sort of rock and roll Beethoven, and then I was at a Beethoven concert last week, and I thought, I wonder what I would have said if I'd known Beethoven and had rum and Coca-Cola with Beethoven. but it's the same sort of thing in a way. I had rum and Coke with Lennon and McCartney. So come back and talk to me in 100 years, and maybe we'll talk about it.
So you've got to share your experience of hanging out, whether it's in a hotel room or wherever it happens to be, and having drinks with the Beatles. How were they as drinking partners?
Well, I mean, they loved to drink. I mean, they drank rum and Coca-Cola, which, to be honest with you, is not my choice of drink. It was kind of sweet, and they liked it. And they would sometimes have a beer. They'd try and order English food at the hotel, and usually it came back pretty awful. But, you know, believe it or not, they were not great connoisseurs of wine, and they were not into fine dining. I mean, right now, Paul, I'm sure, is a health food fanatic. But then you've got to realize these kids, these are sort of semi-working class kids who were not gourmands, if you like. They weren't. They didn't say, "Let's go to the top restaurant in town." No, they would have fish and chips, and they'd have the basic food. You know, because they grew up with basic food. This is what they liked, and of course, today, as you mature, as all of us mature. I mean, I grew up like the Beatles, same kind of working class background, and my food desires back then was very basic. Now I like better food, and so do the Beatles.
Do you have a fact or a short story that you can share with us that maybe no one has ever heard? Something that you had a personal experience with that you can share with us that might be new to us? Well,
there are a couple of stories. I mean, one of them was the night that I should preface this story with a bit of background. Everybody in Hollywood wanted to meet the Beatles. Liberace, Dylan, Joan Baez, Jane Mansfield. Now, Jane Mansfield in those days was one of the sex symbols of Hollywood. So she managed to connive a meeting with the Beatles, and John took a fancy to her. So she said, "Come with us to, my friend Johnny Rivers is performing at a restaurant, a nightclub on Sunset Boulevard called the Whiskey A Go-Go. You know, you'll love him, he's great." Paul went off with a girlfriend. John and George and Ringo and I and a couple of other colleagues on the media went along to the Whiskey A Go-Go. Well, with Jane Mansfield. Now, Jane Mansfield was not only did she expose a lot of flesh, she exposed a lot of publicity. And she knew the Beatles were a way to get some publicity. So we show up at the Whiskey A Go-Go. The place is packed. The Beatles get trapped into a banquet, a big table for Johnny Rivers' performance. And they are very upset because the paparazzi has come in there. They're taking their pictures. They're sticking the cameras up their noses. And they're getting more and more angry. And George is having too much to drink. And finally, before the big show starts, a photographer is asked by George in no mean words. I mean, George was quite... I don't want to be too foul-mouthed, but George could be foul-mouthed when he wanted to. He told the photographer, "Would you please leave?" He actually used stronger language than that. The photographer then stuck the camera under George's nose, flashed it, because in those days they used to have big flashes. George was so upset and had a few to drink, he picked up his drink and he threw it at the photographer, but it missed the photographer and it hit another actress who happened to be there. Everybody started screaming. Bedlam broke loose. We watched this charade unfold, and within seconds, Jane Mansfield, John Lennon, Ringo, they were gone. They were out the door, embarrassed and awful. Then the next day, as we left Los Angeles, somebody gave George a picture of him throwing a drink at the photographer, and did Brian Epstein read George the Riot Act? I mean, this is not the way you behave with the media. So that was an embarrassing story that not too many people know about, but I was there watching this whole charade unfold, and there was Jane Mansfield loving every minute of it.
Did you ever witness any of these girls primarily making extraordinary efforts to try to get into the Beatles hotel rooms?
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, it happened all the time. I mean, what would happen was, for example, because I had an English accent and I didn't look like a Beatle, mothers would approach me with all sorts of wonderful offers, with a little conditional reminder saying, well, I could do something for you if you could do something for me, like my daughter, her life's ambition is to meet the Beatles. Well, after the first thing that happened, I knew it was a no-win situation. and so I would turn them over to the road managers. But the girls did want to get in to see the Beatles, and whatever happened, and things did happen. I mean, there's no doubt. But they sort of kept it under wraps. Now, in today's world of internet and Instagram and all the rest of it, and of course in those days we didn't have our iPhone cameras, we knew that if we reported on Miss Winnipeg getting into hot water with one of the Beatles, that Brian Epstein would then say, Mr. Davis, thank you for joining us. There's no room on our plane. So we were very protective of the boys, I must say, because we liked them and they became members of the family. So some of that stuff went on, quite a bit of that stuff went on, but we did make a big deal about it. I mean, this is why they called them groupies, isn't it?
Exactly. Ivor, when did you write The Beatles and Me on Tour? Before we continue with the conversation here, when was it written and when did you release it?
I wrote it 50 years after I was on tour with the Beatles, and it was in 1964 I was on tour. So it was about 5 years ago I wrote The Beatles and Me on Tour. But a few months ago I wrote the book you just mentioned, which is Manson Exposed, the reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder. And as you pointed out, and as you played Helter Skelter, I was stunned because the Beatles were prominent in this awful murder case. One of the most sensational murder cases involved the Beatles. And if there's time, I'd like to tell you how it happened and what my reaction was when I realized that Charles Manson, who was convicted of the murders 50 years ago last summer, used the Beatle music and their songs to brainwash his band of killers, claiming that the Beatles were sending him messages. I mean, it beggars belief. It's unbelievable, and yet I was in court, and I covered the murder trial, and I covered the Manson case, and when I heard this, I just thought, the world has gone mad.
It's hard to imagine your decade, the 1960s. You traveled with the Beatles. You covered the Warren Report. You were on site when Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, and then you covered the Manson trial. I mean, those years, there's so much history packed in to just a few short years there, and you were there for all of it.
Well, yes, I was. And you asked me a little earlier whether I realized that the Beatles were going to be as great as they turned out to be. And the answer is no, because I think all of us, and I throw you in, I suggest you might agree with me, JB, all of us, when something historic happens, we think it's historic, but then we move on with our lives.
Yeah.
We don't dwell on it. We think this is history, but tomorrow comes tomorrow. So all those things happened to me, and I covered them. And as I said, and as you noted, I went on to another story. But when the Manson case came up, I couldn't believe what I was hearing, because I got very involved in the Manson murders from day one. From the first day of the murders, I was there at the murder house. And then I did my own investigation. I went down to the place called the Spahn Ranch, where Manson lived with his devotees, which is an old, decrepit movie ranch. And if anybody's seen the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Quentin Tarantino shows the ranch the way it is, which is a real, not hellhole, but a beaten-up old place. So there I was in this beaten-up old place, talking to Manson family members who were not involved in the murders. And then they tell me this story about, would you believe, the Beatles were sending secret messages to Charles Manson through the lyrics of the White Album and songs that you played like Helter Skelter, Revolution, Piggies. and made them believe that the Beatles were in on this and were coaching them about an upcoming race war in America, which would wipe out everybody. And it was when I heard that, I thought, everybody's lost their mind. I know the Beatle music. I know the Helter Skelter lyrics. You played the Helter Skelter lyrics. Coming Down Fast is about a fairground ride. How can these people believe what Manson was feeding them? And yet, the punchline was Vincent Bugliosi, the district attorney who convicted Manson, used that exact motive, and he got the jury to convict Manson. And Manson was guilty, and so were his followers. So I listened to that unfold before my very eyes and thought, as I said, the world has gone mad, something is wrong. Am I crazy?
Well, you certainly wouldn't expect these, let's call them subliminal messages, to drive someone to commit such a heinous act. But you even said in the beginning of our conversation that the teenage girls that went to see the Beatles in the early days, said that the Beatles they were waving at them or making a personal connection. Other people along the way said they heard secret messages throughout the Beatles' music. When you played it backwards, there was a special message.
Yes.
You know, all these things permeated and surrounded the Beatles. They couldn't escape it, and they would deny most of it. They would deny almost all of it, yet those things persisted throughout their career. I don't know if there's any explanation for that, or was it just that their personalities were so huge that people could read into it any way they wanted?
Well, I think it's interesting you brought up the subject and you've thrown this back at me. And when I said to you earlier in our conversation that every girl in the audience believed within their heart that each of the Beatles was in love with them, or one of the Beatles was in love with them, they believed it. I mean,
right.
So you've got to realize that let's fast forward to 1969, and Manson was feeding these young people LSD and all sorts of wild mesquite drugs and what have you. And in their rather tortured, drug-riddled minds, maybe the Beatles' lyrics were incitement to whatever. I mean, there was a song in the Beatles' White Album of 1968 called Sexy Sadie.
Sure, yeah.
And there was a member of the Manson family who was one of the killers, Sadie, Susan Atkins, who was known as Sexy Sadie. So Manson said, you see, the Beatles are sending us messages. And when you reflect upon that, you can see sometimes how a depraved mind could believe the most ridiculous thing you can ever think of, because all our minds are malleable or manipulated in many ways. So as we have this discussion, maybe you're talking some sense about why did the girls think it meant a race war? I don't know. I mean, when I heard it, maybe my common sense kicked in and I said, oh, this has got to be rubbish. This is absolute balderdash. Doesn't make sense to me. I know the Beatles. I know they wouldn't tell people to go out and kill, but people believed it. Manson family members did.
I'm scanning my brain trying to come up with a single Beatles song that says anything negative, let alone, gives people guidance to go commit murder. The Beatles, if they were known for one thing, All You Need Is Love is kind of the anthem for what the Beatles stood for in the late 60s. And, so it is a real perversion of what they were doing, because I can't think of a single Beatles lyric that is in any way anything other than inspiring.
Well, yes, I mean, look at it from that point of view, and if you look at the songs and listen to the lyrics, and I've listened to Helter Skelter many times and say, well, is there a gem of suggested murder? But as I say, when you have a mind which is bent by a huge amount of drugs, you're going to believe anything. I mean, LSD was handed out by Manson to the girls at the Spahn movie ranch every day with all these other drugs. I've never taken the heavy drugs myself, but I think, and I'm told that by people who have, that, they're in a different orbit. So, I mean, as ridiculous as it may sound, and I write about it in my Manson Exposed book, the Beatles made me do it. Of course they didn't. Come on. And those who love the Beatles don't want to hear me say that. Don't want to even hear that, but it's part of the awful criminal history that you and I are currently talking about.
I'm trying to remember any interviews or discussions with any of the Beatles. Did they ever acknowledge or respond to those assertions from Manson?
They did. I was able to speak personally to John Lennon about it in 1972 when John was on his lost weekend, which lasted 18 months, and he left Yoko in New York, and he'd come to the West Coast with May Pang, who was a young lady who was set up by Yoko. And I went to see John, and I asked John, he was living in a house in Bel Air, a rented house, belonging to Lou Adler, who was a famous record producer. And I said to John, I covered the trial, John, and I can't believe all this ridiculousness about the White Album. So first of all, John didn't want to go there, but when I told him I knew all about it, I covered the trial, he said, he said the problem, in a way, with Beatle lyrics is, look at some of the songs. Some people think they know what our songs are about, and they read into our songs like, even Bob Dylan said, I think I get high with a little help from my friends, and the lyrics are not exactly that, there's something else. So everybody, even Dylan, thought they were talking about drugs in that song. And there were so many stories. The one you mentioned a moment ago, Paul is dead. And we know he's dead because if you play this record back to front or whatever, you will get the message. So all these myths and misnomers and whatever you want to call them happen, I'm sure, with many lyrics. And in the Beatles' case, many of their lyrics were misinterpreted. And that's why Manson got away with it. He would play the White Album like 20 times a day while his followers were on drugs, and they began to believe. Remember Jim Jones in,
of course,
Diana's
Jonestown, sure. Mm-hmm.
Jonestown, right?
Yep.
And here was a guy who told 900 people to swallow Kool-Aid that just happened to be poison. So they did it. He mesmerized them. So, when you see those kind of things happening, and I suppose you could say Adolf Hitler in World War II brainwashed his, Nazi party. I don't know. We could open it out. I'm sure you could come up with a few other examples of insanity.
We're going to run out of time here, so I'm going to ask one more question about this drug reference in the Beatles, because I just want your opinion, and I know there's no real answer to this question, but Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, what's your opinion?
I don't think, I think there's a bit of both there. LSD, yeah. John denies it. I'm not so sure. It could be an LSD reference, a very clever reference. John said it wasn't. But don't forget, the Beatles were also into drugs. And I would sort of be on the fence with that one. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds could be LSD, could not. What do you think?
I lean toward thinking it probably was a clever way of John Lennon incorporating it into a song, but I can also understand why he'd deny it. And I will also say that the first song I played for bumper music for our conversation tonight was the song Dr. Robert, who was written after the I think it was a dentist who supplied the Beatles unknowingly to them with their first hit of LSD.
Yes, he did. He did. I mean, they went to a dinner party, as you know, I'm sure. And as dessert, the dentist, I think it was George's dentist, impregnated their coffee or their after-dinner drink with LSD. And they kind of went a bit crazy. And then, of course, as you know, Paul makes no big secret of the fact that he imbibed LSD. So, I mean, the Beatles were into drugs. I mean, John was very much into drugs. So, who knows? Maybe some of their songs were inspired by drugs. But I know very often, Hey Jude, I remember a music writer on the newspaper I worked for said, hey, her name was Judith. She said, Paul has written this song about me. I did an interview with him 3 months ago, and he's come and written Hey Jude about me. Well, it wasn't. It was about Julian Lennon, about John's son. But so everybody sees a lyric and says, hey, JV, this is my song. He's writing about me. He's writing about Ivor. Probably not.
And I think the difference here when it comes to the Beatles is you have to care enough about the music to see those references, even if they're a bit misguided, to think they're writing about you or to think it's something about you. If you don't care about the music, you're not going to even look for those things. And that's really the difference.
You've hit the nail on the head perfectly, JV, and that's exactly it. If you want to adopt it as your theme song, you can do it, and you can find justification.
One more question about the Manson story. Bugliosi obviously wrote the book Helter Skelter. It was also turned into a movie, and it was his account of the crime plus the trial. It's come under fire a little bit recently. Are you involved or aware of the controversy, and what are your thoughts on it if you are?
Well, here's the situation. I knew Vincent Bugliosi very well indeed because I covered the trial for a year, and I knew him after he wrote the book. The problem with Vince was, number one, he did a fantastic job. He lived the Manson murder case 24 hours a day for nearly a year. At the same time, Vincent was not a modest man. Vincent, in his mind, solved the murder. When I spoke to all the cops that worked hundreds of hours, they said, well, not really. We were there doing a lot of work. So Vince was a dedicated, ego-driven prosecutor, but maybe you needed it. He hated Manson. They were, you could see the sparks fly, but maybe to get somebody convicted, you need to have hostility and hate and all that kind of stuff. So Vincent did an incredible job in getting the conviction, in getting a jury to believe the thesis that the White Album was behind the murders. I mean, come on, that's a pretty large swallow, isn't it, JB?
Yeah, it really is. Before I let you go, you also wrote a book for children, didn't you, Ivor?
Yes, I did. I wrote a book. I mean, as a slight change of pace, I wrote a book called Ladies and Gentlemen, the Penguins, and it was based on the fact when I was cruising and doing lectures. I went to Argentina, I went to the Falkland Islands, there were a lot of penguins, and they all quacked with an English accent because it's an English island. And I thought, wow, what would happen if the penguins decided to become rock stars? And they did become rock stars, and I got a great illustrator, and, it was kind of a spoof on the Beatles. Their first big hit was I Want to Hold Your Flipper, and they all appeared. They all went to New York at the Penguins, and they appeared on that terrific variety show in New York called the Ed Pelican Show. So, I had a bit of fun with that, and I'm still having a lot of fun with that. And can I just throw in, because I know we're running out of time, But I'm delighted that my Manson Exposed book is coming out on audio next week on February the 18th. And I haven't heard it yet, but I don't read it, but apparently it's not a bad read. I wrote it, but I haven't heard it. So it's been a terrific time talking to you, JV, and I must say I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it as well. Just let people know where they can find all of your work. I mentioned the website a couple of times, but where can they find that? Where can they find the audiobook when it comes out?
The audiobook, which comes out on February the 18th, I mean, there are so many outlets, Amazon and iTunes and YouTunes and MeTunes. I mean, wherever audiobooks are available, my Manson Exposed is available. But if you have any problem and you don't know, you missed that, then go to my ivordavisbooks.com, and there'll be a lot of stuff about the audiobook. So I hope they listen to the book or even read the book, which is fun. And as I say, what a pleasure to be with you for this time, JB.
Well, I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll get a chance to get you back. I would like to talk more about the Manson Project as well, because there's a whole show just in that. But this has been a fabulous treat for me. And Ivor, thanks so much, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks for having me.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by JV Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal, or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.